Students applying to highly selective colleges have the grades. They've taken a breadth of classes. They've also demonstrated depth of understanding of the core subject areas. And they feel that they can represent themselves well, even through their extracurricular activities. So, what is it that extra that really makes you stand out? And let's find out. Welcome to Fresh Off the Boat. This is our podcast series in 2024. And my first guest this evening is Dylan Schuler. Dylan is a friend of one of the student I worked with, and she was at Stanford, and they were batchmate, I guess, Dylan.
Yep.
So yeah, it's kind of an auspicious start to the whole season of interviews that I have lined up. The format of today's discussion will be in two sections. One will be about Dylan's high school life and his preparation for university, and the second section we'll cover is more to do with what he did in college at Stanford, and in retrospect, what he thinks he could have done better in terms of not just the application process, but also making the right choices while he was in university.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dylan. I grew up in Washington State in the US. And then just kind of some background about my education pathway. I attended public school, basically the government schools from kindergarten through 12th standard. And then afterwards went to Stanford University for my bachelor's, which I did in Earth Systems, which is basically what Stanford calls their environmental science program. And I also have a minor in history from that. Afterwards, I hadn't gotten the chance to study abroad during my 4 years at Stanford, but I'd always wanted to do that. And so I reached out to the University of Hyderabad, since they have a Study in India program, and they were able to accept me as just an independent student to study plant science for the semester. And so I did that, got back January of this year. And then just some more kind of background about what life was like for me as I was applying for college. My mom was the first in her family to attend college, and my dad had a few people in his family who'd attended, but not a ton of kind of support or mentorship there. And so as I was applying for Stanford and other kind of highly select colleges, I did have kind of some help and advice from my parents, but they also still were kind of learning about the process of applying to sort of like the highly select or other kind of schools, since a lot of where they'd applied was kind of state schools within our state. Yeah, and so I definitely, through that process, had to learn a lot about how college admissions process works in the US. And so I'm hoping that I can share some of that with all of you today.
The first question I have was more to do with preparation in high school. So there's so much pressure in terms of hormones going haywire, as well as working with so many different choices you have to make, the classes you have to choose, the academic rigor you can cope with, as well as the extracurriculars that you wish to sort of go deeper into. So how was it like being in high school, making those choices, and did you plan everything out, or it just happened by and by?
It was definitely a little bit planning, a little bit just how things worked out. My mom actually at the time was teaching, or is still a teacher at a middle school. And at the time she was teaching a class on college preparation, trying to get kind of middle schoolers to think ahead to, like, in 4 years when they're applying for college, where do they want to be to have the best chances they're applying. And so she was always very big on kind of planning out your classes, having your 4-year plan. And so I definitely had that and kind of knew what things I should be doing to be able to get into a college, but didn't really know from like my ninth standard year necessarily like which college was like the college I wanted to go to. And definitely wasn't thinking at the time that Stanford was where I would end up. And so it was partially kind of doing preparation to put myself in a good position when it was time to apply for college, but didn't necessarily have an exact plan of where I wanted to go and everything all laid out.
So when you look at the major that you chose, environmental science, and a minor in history, so was that something premeditated? Did your classes at high school also indicate that that's where you're going? Very often students, ask me, should I take this at this level, this course? Or I'm not sure I'll follow through in college and do that as a major. Will it be easier to get in if I study this or apply to this college within the university, and so on and so forth? So tell us a little bit about the breadth and depth of your course in high school and how did it all pan out?
like I said, I ended up doing my major in basically environmental science and then minor in history. And the reason for that was that I actually initially was thinking I wanted to do history, but also was very interested in environmental science. And so I was kind of deciding between the two, but had a preference for history. But as I began taking classes in college, I realized that environmental science was really what I wanted to do career-wise. And so decided to do that as my major. And then still, because I was interested in history, do a history minor. But I'd been taking classes in both of those subjects as well in high school. And so at my high school, there wasn't any history class offered in 9th standard, just 10th through 12th. And so I took the kind of advanced history classes each year. And then in my 11th standard year, there was sort of the advanced placement curriculum for US history. And so I took that class, but I also wanted to take, they called it Honors Junior Humanities. And so it was basically a class that was taught by 2 teachers with kind of twice the enrollment capacity. And it was taught for 2 class periods. And it covered both English and history, but also kind of art, philosophy, and a lot of other subjects that my high school didn't offer, but kind of got integrated into this humanities class. And so I basically ended up taking 2 history classes on kind of the same subject, but from different angles. The AP class being more of just the kind of like learn the dates and events and everything and kind of very structured content-wise. And then the humanities class being more of the kind of deep philosophical thinking about like the importance of historical events and kind of the importance of human agency throughout history. And so that was definitely, that experience of taking both of those classes together was one of the big sparks for my interest in history. But I was also taking the environmental science class that my high school offered. And so I think I definitely was going through a process of trying to figure out what it is that I wanted, what it is I'm interested in, but also what it is that feels like it'll be the best outcome kind of career-wise and kind of a field to study long-term. And so even though I was most interested in history in high school, as I got to college and began taking classes, I realized that to do history, kind of what my interest would guide me toward as terms of a professional career would basically be just kind of sitting in archives doing research, which I'd be interested in, but I didn't know if that was like the only thing I ever wanted to do. Whereas with environmental science, I thought that I kind of had more options for where I could end up working. I could do field work, I could do kind of research in a lab, I could do kind of computer science-based research. And so I wanted some more of that flexibility for like the type of work that I could do. And so that ended up kind of being the kind of primary factor in terms of when it was time to kind of go deep into one subject. That was what kind of convinced me that environmental science was the right option.
Great. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of the whole application timeline. So how was it that you planned all of this, starting from, say, SAT prep?
Yeah, so I got kind of lucky when it came to that. One of the private schools in my area during my 8th standard year offered basically a free PSAT. So I always forget if it's the pre-SAT or practice SAT is what the P stands for. But basically, yeah. So basically kind of like basically can use it like a practice for the SAT. And so I started taking it my 8th standard year and then took it again 9th, 10th, and 11th. And so basically got a lot of experience just doing standardized testing from that kind of progression and experience. And so I got pretty good at just kind of like the sort of skills you need just for test taking and like the kind of timed environment. And then that kind of also allowed me to then kind of fine tune where it was I needed to focus when it came to studying for the SAT. And so I ended up taking the SAT, I believe I took it twice, I think once my junior year, once my senior year, so 11th and 12th standard. And so at that point, kind of the preparation was mostly using some kind of online tools. Like I think Khan Academy is one that basically you can plug in your kind of test score, like the information from when you've done the PSAT, and then they'll go through and figure out kind of like what type of questions did you miss, and then help you just kind of practice those particular types of questions. And so I did some of that to prepare for the SAT. I also took the ACT, which is sort of the other alternative you can do instead of the SAT. And even though I had all this experience doing the PSAT and took the SAT multiple times, and only took the ACT once and hadn't done as much prep work for it, that ended up being my kind of better score when you do the equivalent between the two. And so I think what really helped me was just kind of getting experience with the test taking process and kind of what types of questions they would ask on the sort of standardized exams like the SAT or ACT. And so I think ultimately just kind of like the number of times that I was taking each one was, I think, kind of the best way to prepare for them.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, right? Like you were preparing for the SAT, but you just on a whim perhaps took the ACT and did better. So yeah, it's a good tip for kids who sort of are doing SAT prep at the moment. So the other thing about academics in terms of your profile that's sent to universities is teacher recommendations, or even maybe external recommendations from people that you perhaps interned with or worked at labs. In high school, it's becoming increasingly common that kids who are aiming for highly selective schools do get external recommenders. However, colleges don't recommend that students send too many recommendation letters, but that does become a point of discussion with most families that we work with. So I know you must have worked directly with your school, but was there some thought that you could do more than just get references from your school? And then finally, which teachers did you approach? What was the mood with which you approached them, and why do you think they gave you good records?
Yeah, so in terms of kind of where I was looking for letters of recommendation, it definitely was mostly through my school. I was involved in other organizations outside of my school, but it was less kind of like research or being mentored by people, and more typically kind of like political or activist organizations. And so there wasn't really like someone to go to ask for a letter of recommendation. But I was definitely involved in like a lot of different clubs and organizations within the school. And so kind of without intending to do it as a way to get letters of recommendation, I ended up having a lot of teachers and people within the school that were basically my mentors for me, and were as a result kind of very willing to write good letters of recommendation. And so I think that's what I would kind of advise, is that just whatever you're interested in, figuring out where the opportunities are to do that within your school, and then basically finding who it is that's kind of the mentor for that, either that class you want to take or kind of organizations, clubs, anything like that that exists within your high school. And then those will just kind of become the people that are really excited to write letters of recommendation for you. And so for me, what that looked like was I was involved in kind of the student council and some student government. And so I was working with like the principal and kind of the administration of the school. And so the principal of my high school was one of my people who wrote a letter of recommendation for me. And then I also had one of my history teachers that was actually for the humanities class that I mentioned earlier, was another one of my people who wrote letters of recommendation. And so it basically was just kind of an organic process of wherever I was the most involved in kind of whatever aspects of my high school experience I really wanted to highlight for the college application. That's the teachers that I was asking for letters of recommendation. And in my experience, I found that as long as you have a relationship with the teacher person ahead of time, that people are generally very willing to write letters of recommendation. And if they've been working with you for some period of time, they're usually very excited to see you succeed and are eager to do what they can through writing a letter of recommendation for you to help you do that.
If you're applying to the US, you have a common application system, and there's also a coalition application. And then there are individual universities or consortium applications, like the University of California system, and so on and so forth. So you have to choose whether your schools, the final choice of schools that you're applying to, and then identify the particular platform you'll be sending your applications from. And in those applications, it's pretty common, and most of the information is basic. So the first few sections would be demographic information, family information, academic history, and then there's more detailing. So academic achievement or honors, you could list a few, explain them. There's a section where you can mention all your extracurricular activities and achievements. So there's a list of 10 sort of activities you could list. And then there's also this additional information section where you can elaborate on some of your activities. So there's these sections of the common application form that are pretty exhaustive and kind of can be looked at as different stores in an empty mall. And suppose you're the proprietor of this mall and you want to kind of make sure that your mall gets great footfall, and different stores and flagship stores sort of are housed so that there's a good good branding element to your property. Likewise, a college application can also be looked at as an avenue and place to brand your achievements, your identity, your stories, reflect on who you are, and write about what you think, feel, and value in your essays. So it's a lot to digest for someone getting into it. So there's a lot of nitty gritty, a lot of detailing that goes in to fill out applications. How was it for you, Dylan? How did you approach this? And did you spend a lot of time at your school counselor's office working on this?
Yeah, I would say honestly, the process of like really like just filling out all the applications in hindsight definitely was very overwhelming. Especially, I think one piece of advice I would give is that try to get started as early as possible. I know my parents were telling me the kind of summer before my 12th standard year that like I should be doing the applications now, I should be doing as much as I can before school starts. And so I was doing some work during that summer, but kind of left a lot of the work to do until the fall once school had already started. And then it was definitely a lot to be kind of writing all these essays and even like kind of filling out all the forms and information for the applications while I was also trying to finish off my last year of high school. And so that would be one big piece of advice I'd have for something I wish I'd done differently was to kind of start early, get as much done as you can when you're not also taking classes and in school during high school. And I think also just the process and the amount of work involved in doing all the different applications. So as you said, yeah, there's the common application, the coalition application, and then some universities just have their own application that's entirely separate. And so that actually became a factor as I'd started applying for more and more colleges of like whether a university was part of the common application was mostly what I was using. And so there were some times where if a university that I was kind of interested in had their own application, that was kind of a criterion to basically eliminate it and not apply there, just because of how much work was required to kind of write new essays and fill out new applications each time I was applying for another college. And so I think that's definitely something to be mindful of how much time you have to apply to say like 8, 9, 10 universities, that once you're doing that many applications, whether or not say like 5 versus 8 of them are part of the common application can make a big difference. And so, yeah, that's definitely just something to be aware of is that it's definitely beneficial to try to find colleges that you're interested in. They're all part of the same application network, because then it allows you kind of to spend more time on those essays and really refine the essays to increase your chances of getting in there instead of having to kind of duplicate all your effort multiple times, but not be able to put in as much effort on kind of the one application for colleges that you're wanting to do.
Okay, so now let's talk about the USP, right? In your application, what do you think stood out? Students applying to highly selective colleges have the grades, they've taken a breadth of classes, they've also demonstrated depth of understanding of the core subject areas, and they feel that they can represent themselves well even through their extracurricular activities. So what is it that extra that really makes you stand out? And let's find out from you, Dylan.
Yeah, so I actually got a little bit of advice on this when I was in the process of applying. And so as part of the process for especially some of the highly select schools, once you have turned in your application, they also ask you to do an interview with them. And when I was doing my interview with Stanford, the interviewer was very excited about the application process, and so was showing a lot of insights on how it worked. And what he said was that even though Stanford has about a 3% acceptance rate, they actually assume that about 80% of the people who apply could be a great fit at Stanford and like succeed academically and kind of meet all the criteria that they want, but they just ultimately don't have enough seats to offer to 80% of their applicants. And so the way he put it was that it doesn't quite come down to chance, but it kind of, to some degree, is about just kind of what type of students they're looking for in each year. And so kind of the example he used is that they might be looking for someone who plays like a particular musical instrument from a particular state one year. And if you happen to be the person who plays that instrument from that state, that you'll get in and never know that that's the detail that made it so that you got in and someone else didn't. And so I think the kind of strategy then as you're applying is to kind of have a breadth of different things that you're involved in. So for me, I did debate, which was one of my more kind of academic interests. And then I was also involved in kind of like some politics and activism out in the community. So that was more like kind of my community involvement. I also ran cross country and was one of the team captains my senior year. And so that was both kind of leadership within school, but also athletics. And so I think I had kind of just my interest in different areas of life that I was pursuing. And so I don't know kind of which one of those was really the thing that made them say like, yes, we're going to accept Dylan. But it was just a matter of what I was interested in was what I put my time into. And then it both made it so that I was kind of well-rounded and involved in lots of different things in different areas of life, but also was trying to kind of spend time and put effort into what I was involved in and what I was interested in. And so I think that kind of balancing of being involved in a breadth of different things, but also trying to get really involved in them. And like if you end up in a leadership position, that's even better. If you're taking on kind of projects and initiatives within different groups you're involved in, that's helpful both in terms of showing the college that you're really passionate about your interests, but also gives you kind of more material to be able to write about for essays. Since for a lot of colleges, you'll be writing kind of like 5 to 10 different essays on different prompts. And so having kind of 5 to 10 different experiences that you can really write a good essay on is really important, so that you're not just having maybe like 2 or 3 different topics you can write about, or like 2 or 3 different things you're involved in. That it's helpful to have enough breadth that you can not be just repeating the same topics, but also have enough depth that you can write a really really good essay on those different experiences.
Yeah, so there's one thing which was a thread which I kind of caught on, was activism and politics, right? So, and it seems that you were really passionate about it. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you did in high school, which got you really excited about student activism, and what does it really mean to you?
Yeah, so I think for me in high school, it was sort of a matter of just kind of like learning the skills of activism, kind of learning more about how politics operates at like a local or national level, and then trying to figure out where I felt I could do the most good. And so one of the projects that I was involved in high school, kind of one of those examples of a thing where I was taking the lead on a project, was doing basically a book donation drive to collect kind of gently used books for an organization called Books to Prisoners that basically tries to get like educational material or books to people that are in prison. And so that was definitely one experience where I felt like I was trying to balance kind of what can I do as a high schooler where I can't vote, I don't have a ton of kind of political power, but I'm at the school where there's always a lot of books that people have that are kind of unused that can go to this other organization that is able to get them to people that are looking for things to read. And so that was kind of one example of where it was both a matter of kind of what am I interested in, but also kind of going through that process of trying to figure out where can I do the most good, which was useful on its own, just in terms of wanting to be involved in politics and activism, but then also being able to kind of then write an essay or show colleges like even before I'm at college, I'm trying to go through the process of trying to figure out like where is my kind of purpose in life, what is it that I feel like I can do the most good, and kind of where do my skills match people's needs. And so I think that was both important in terms of like the experience itself, but then in the context of applying for college, it was good to think about it both in terms of the actual action of taking on that project, but also what I was learning and kind of like growing as a person and learning more about myself. I think both of those are kind of important to discuss as you're writing your college applications, and kind of they're just good things to be intentional and aware of as you're doing different activities in high school.
Second section is more about your life at Stanford. And I think every time I meet a student who's thinking of applying to highly selective colleges, I say, look, you got to think like maybe a sophomore at the university that you're at. Don't think like a high school student. I think that's really critical to really know and even network in advance to connect with people. So there's this opportunity to listen to several interviews. You can be an armchair researcher and pretty much get to hear so many students who've been there, done that. They share their stories. They're obviously very popular YouTube channels, as well as influencers, college influencers who are on Instagram. But more than that, I think have an insight into what your original plan is and what you think, what is it that you want to really achieve out of this process, and why does this process seem so intrusive and wants to know so much more about you? So question and have that why answered and be unique in presenting what that means. Let's move on to the second part, which is your life at Stanford. So how was it like moving in? Did you get that honeymoon experience, and did that sort of honeymoon sort of wave off eventually? And then what was the ground reality?
Yeah, so I guess I'll kind of just provide an overview at first of kind of what my kind of student life was like over the 4 years. And so I think one of the big kind of driving factors of student life in college in general, and especially for my experience, was kind of the student dorm or hostel life. And so for my first year, I was living in an all freshman dorm. But then that was also the year that COVID happened. And so about halfway through the year, we all got sent home. And classes became remote and we were no longer on campus. And so I definitely had kind of that initial taste of like the moving out, getting to live in a hostel on my own, but then had to move back home for a while. And then sophomore year was entirely online as well. And so I was taking classes while living with my parents. And then my third year, junior year, we were able to move back to campus again. And so that year and my senior year, I lived in a student-run house. And so basically all of the cooking and cleaning for the house were done by the students who lived there. And then my senior year, I was also the residential assistant for that dorm. And so basically was kind of in charge of handling some of the logistics and like ordering supplies for the dorm, kind of coordinating the jobs for students and or the residents in the dorm. And so that was kind of like my progression was initially in an all freshman dorm and then home for COVID and then back in a student run dorm. And so I think kind of what my initial experience was when I was in the all freshman dorm was definitely a very good experience. I know that I had friends that were in all sorts of different dorms. Some of them were kind of like all four classes in the same dorm. Some of them were all freshmen. And I think everyone always enjoyed kind of whichever living situation they had. But for me, I think the all freshman dorm was really nice because basically everyone there had just moved away from home, didn't really know anyone else. And so everyone was very eager to make friends. And so it definitely made it so that it didn't feel as lonely because very quickly people were very eager to meet you, get to know you, become friends. And so even though I didn't know anyone when I was kind of moving down to Stanford, because I was in an all freshman dorm, I think it was very easy to make friends very quickly.
So about academic choices that you made and the journey through senior year, what was it like, and what, in retrospect, what would you change in choosing your gen eds, electives, and declaring your major, the timing of all of it? What would you want to share with us, and what do you think students should know in advance?
Yeah, so I think the biggest realization is actually one that I just had in the last week or so. That kind of I'm now back in the process of applying for jobs now that I've graduated, and so I kind of realized that what I was really interested in was environmental science, and that's how I chose my major. But I've also realized that I think a lot of the kind of coursework that I had was sort of understanding environmental issues, understanding how kind of social systems and our political system and economics kind of affects the environment and vice versa. And so a lot of what I was learning was very interesting and kind of not just academic, but more kind of the theory side of kind of why do things operate the way they do. But I've realized it now that it was less focused on kind of what can we do about it, more kind of on the identifying the problem than solving the problem. And so I think that even though what I was interested in was environmental science, I wish I'd kind of taken a second to really think through what is it that I want to do and what are kind of the skills that I'll need to be able to take action. And so I think if I had it to do over again, I probably would have done more of like a kind of bioengineering degree and tried to figure out, like take some classes from the environmental science department to kind of figure out what are the issues that are most pressing to work on, but then have my main focus for my major be on kind of learning actual kind of skills and tools to be able to either create products or create solutions to the problems that I was learning about. Yeah, and so I think that also kind of reflects that I've become more interested in either at some point being involved like in a startup or becoming a professor with my own lab to kind of be able to work on projects and kind of help bring people together to focus on kind of some interconnected issues. And so I think that now knowing that in hindsight, there are things I could have done differently. But I think that's also just kind of always going to be the case that whatever you know 5 years from now would have made it so that you could have done things better now. But it's what you do over the course of the next 5 years that causes you to have those realizations. And so it's kind of a paradox where the things you do or what seem like mistakes in hindsight are really the things that allow you to know that you wish you'd done things differently. And so I don't think there's really a reason to have regret over that or anything. But yeah, I think I wish I had been more intentional about figuring out what it was I wanted to do rather than just what I was interested in.
Thanks for sharing an honest answer to that question. It's really important for students to look at it as a journey, and it's a matter of 4 years, you're exploring different choices. The lesson that you learn in retrospect is kind of a blessing because probably can evaluate things that you go doing forward. Stanford has this whole startup culture, and I'm really excited to know like you're thinking about environmental science and the startup world. Sometimes you feel that doing good and social impact entrepreneurship is sometimes kind of pushed under the rug and not talked about too much. So what are the resources you think Stanford gave you to start thinking about the startup idea?
Yeah, so I think ironically, I don't know that I was quite as interested in kind of being involved in a startup at some point when I was at Stanford. Because it's in Silicon Valley and a lot of the startups there are very involved in kind of tech and computer science. Those weren't areas that I was as interested in. And so I think a lot of that kind of not quite went over my head, but just wasn't something that I put a lot of time into looking into. It was actually when I was studying abroad at the University of Hyderabad that they have a startup incubator there, specifically in the School of Life Science. I think it's called Aspire BioNest. And so they've started up a lot of different companies, all focused on kind of making tangible changes in kind of the food system, agriculture, biopharma, and so kind of topics that were a lot more interesting to me. So, for example, I think some of the businesses that they're currently starting up have to do with kind of creating plant-based protein, but coming from just basically leaves as opposed to like food or seeds of plants. And so, like for one, as someone who's vegan, and very exciting to learn about kind of new types of plant protein that people are trying to create, but also just in terms of the kind of impact that would have on like the food system overall. I think that was where I kind of began to think seriously about whether sort of my view of startups as being only about kind of like just tech and like software development wasn't really accurate, and that there was a lot of room for kind of doing the types of projects I was interested in, but in a startup environment. And then from there, then kind of going back and like the things I'd heard about startups at Stanford then became more relevant. Yeah, I think it was just a matter of, I guess maybe the sort of larger theme or thing to take away is that it was sort of the experience of figuring out where it is that my interests line up with what it is I want to do, and sort of kind of where the sort of interest and action kind of find an intersection. And I think that's definitely helpful for me as I'm thinking about what I want to do next and what I want to do going forward, is finding something both that I'm interested in, but also is the kind of like type of action and change that I want to be a part of and that I think I could be the most useful in.
Again, thank you. I think this pretty much wraps up the question set that I have.